The year was 1902, a year when death was an everyday companion. Diseases spread like wildfire through villages and towns. Families buried their children as often as they buried their elders. In this world of constant mourning, grief became ritual, and rituals became tradition. One of the most unsettling of these was post-mortem photography, a practice born out of sorrow but steeped in darkness. Families posed with their dead, arranging them as though still alive, desperate to capture one final image before the grave swallowed memory forever. In a small town, surrounded by fields of withered grass and forests that locals swore were haunted, one such photograph was arranged. It was not a wealthy place. It was not even remarkable, but what it preserved would haunt history. The home of the deceased was a dim, narrow building with creaking wooden floors. Curtains were drawn to block the daylight, for tradition demanded shadow when death lingered inside. In the center of the parlor, the coffin was placed, the body carefully dressed in its finest clothes. The family gathered, their faces pale with sorrow and exhaustion. Neighbors joined, whispering condolences in hushed tones. The air smelled of dust, wilted flowers, and the faint sting of kerosene lamps. And then the photographer arrived. His equipment was heavy, the kind that demanded patience. He unfolded the tripod, draped the black cloth, and prepared his glass plates. Such men were not merely craftsmen, they were witnesses to grief. They entered homes that others feared, stood close to the dead, and immortalized loss with unsettling precision. On this day in 1902, his camera would capture more than sorrow. It would capture a hidden truth. The mourners were positioned carefully. The widow stood behind the coffin, her veil trembling with each shallow breath. Children were placed in front, their small faces frozen in expressions that were neither grief nor understanding, just emptiness. A brother stood rigid at the side, eyes darting toward the coffin and then away again. Friends and neighbors filled the edges, silent, respectful, obedient to the ritual. But in that group, among the black coats and solemn stares, stood someone else. Someone who should not have been there. Someone who carried a secret darker than mourning. The shutter clicked. A moment was frozen. And with it, a murderer was hidden in plain sight. At first glance, the photograph seemed ordinary. Another artifact of dark history. Another unsettling image tucked into the pages of forgotten events. But those who studied it more closely felt something stir. A hand that seemed too heavy on the coffin, pressing rather than resting. A faint smile where there should have been sorrow. Eyes that looked not at the camera but past it, as if calculating. It was subtle, so subtle that the truth would remain buried for weeks, then months. Yet even without knowledge, people whispered. The family was known for its strangeness. Old rumors spoke of a forbidden language whispered in their home, words outsiders dared not translate. There had been quarrels in the weeks before death. Shouts heard in the night. A door slammed so violently that windows rattled. And then, suddenly, illness struck. Or so they claimed. The death certificate said fever. But the town had doubts. Too convenient, too swift, too quiet. Still, grief is heavy, and suspicion dies easily under its weight. So the photograph was taken, and life moved forward. But the image remained, whispering its own accusations. Look at it again. The widow's veil is heavy, her body trembling. The children's stares are hollow, unsettling in their emptiness. And then, in the corner, almost lost in shadow, a figure stands. Too composed, too calm. The faint trace of satisfaction lingers in their expression. It was not obvious then, but history would come to see it clearly. This was not simply a funeral photograph. It was a crime scene, disguised as ritual. The people in the town did not yet know. But the truth had already been captured, burned into the photograph's surface by light and chemicals. Every detail was preserved, the guilt, the deception, the killer hiding behind solemn eyes. This was not the first time old photos carried chilling secrets. Across history, disturbing images reveal what their subjects tried to bury. A vanished child seen again in a family portrait. A stranger appearing in the window of a haunted place. A smile stretched too wide, hinting at thoughts no one dared imagine. Photographs are memory, but they are also mirrors. They reveal more than we want them to. And this photograph from 1902 revealed a murderer. The townspeople could not yet see it. But in time, suspicions would spread. In time, whispers would turn into accusations. In time, the photograph would become more than a memento, it would become evidence. But on the day it was taken, it was just another ritual, just another attempt to hold on to the dead. Just another moment of mourning. The camera shutter closed. The plates were packed away. The mourners dispersed. The coffin was lowered into the ground, and no one realized that the killer had stood among them, immortalized forever. The photograph survives even now, passed down through families, whispered about as a cursed relic. And those who dare to look at it feel uneasy, as though the faces are staring back, as though the coffin is not what demands attention, but the figure beside it. The figure that hides its crime in plain sight. In 1902, the dead were remembered. But the living could lie. And sometimes, lies smile for the camera. The town was small, hidden between rolling fields and forests too dense for comfort. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, and everyone knew each other's secrets. In 1902, towns like this were worlds unto themselves. News traveled slowly, but gossip traveled fast. A cough behind a closed door was spoken of by sunrise. A quarrel between neighbors became legend before the week was done. The streets were narrow, lined with stone and wood, where horses clattered and children's laughter often felt hollow. At night, gas lamps hissed in the mist, casting long, crooked shadows. To the outsider, the town seemed ordinary. But to those who lived within it, there was always something unspoken, something lurking in silence. They whispered of the woods to the north, a place said to be haunted by vanished children. Some claimed to hear them still, laughter carried on the wind, cries swallowed by the trees. Others avoided the river that cut through the fields, believing it was cursed, a place where too many had drowned under suspicious circumstances. Every family seemed to carry a burden, every household a secret. And when a death occurred, those secrets often grew louder. It was in this atmosphere of suspicion that the funeral photograph was taken, a single disturbing image in a town already burdened with shadows. This was a community shaped by hardship. Poverty gnawed at the edges of life. Work was grueling. Food was scarce. The seasons were merciless. Men labored in fields, their backs bent and broken before age claimed them. Women endured long nights, tending to sick children by candlelight, praying to God and fearing the devil in equal measure. Beneath it all lay something darker, a knowledge that death came quickly, but sometimes it did not come naturally. The town's church stood tall on a hill, its bell tolling for every passing soul. Yet, even within its walls, whispers of forbidden language lingered, words not of prayer but of curses. Families accused one another of old superstitions, of dealings with forces unseen. Some homes were avoided entirely, called haunted places by children who dared each other to run past their gates. And one such home, the home where the photograph was taken, was known to draw longer stares and shorter conversations. Look closely at the setting. A small house, yes, but always with its curtains drawn tighter than the others. Neighbors said strange noises came from within. They spoke of arguments in the dead of night, of lights burning long after midnight, of children seen one day and not the next, explained away as illness, though illness always seemed to visit that family more than most. The funeral had brought them out into the open. The photograph forced them into the gaze of others, and for once, the town could see them together, captured forever. A strange family, bound not just by grief, but by something colder. The photograph was not yet understood. To most, it was simply another relic of dark history, an unsettling memory to place in the family's drawer. But to those who knew the town's shadows, the image was unsettling in another way. It seemed to confirm what they had long feared, that within this family lay chilling secrets, hidden truths no coffin could bury. It wasn't just the dead who were mourned. It was the living, too, for in this town, Survival often meant silence, and silence bred mystery. A neighbor might suspect, a friend might know, but no one spoke openly, because speaking openly was dangerous. The streets reflected this silence. By day, people greeted one another politely, their words measured, their smiles thin. By night, shutters closed quickly, doors were bolted, and the streets emptied. Children were warned not to wander, and those who dared linger after dark swore the town itself seemed to breathe, its alleys watching, its houses listening. The photograph, though still unseen by most, was about to stir these shadows. Because once the glass plates were developed, once the eerie details came to life, the town would find itself staring at something it could not explain. Look at the edges of the picture. Notice the figures not meant to be there. A child too pale, a man too rigid, a face that seems to smile when all others weep. The photograph is not just a family memento. It is a mirror of the town's sinister past, a frozen moment exposing what no one dared to admit. The funeral might have ended, the coffin lowered, the mourners dispersed, but the town would not move on. Not truly. Because photographs last. Photographs remember. Photographs whisper. And in this one, in particular, a whisper would grow into suspicion. A suspicion that the town itself seemed to nurture. For this was no ordinary place, no ordinary family, and no ordinary death. The town had always carried shadows. But now, those shadows had faces. And soon, those faces would be named. Death was not the end. At least, not in the eyes of families in 1902. When breath left the body, traditions began, rituals meant to preserve memory, to hold on to life just a little longer. Some of these were comforting. Others felt like they belonged to another world, a world where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than we dare to believe. Among the strangest of these rituals was post-mortem photography. Today, it seems macabre, disturbing. But in the early 20th century, it was not only accepted, it was expected. For many families, photographs were rare. Cameras were expensive. Most households might only afford a single picture in their lifetime. So when death arrived, the family called for the photographer. The coffin was brought into the parlor. The body dressed in its finest clothes. A chair placed just so. Curtains drawn, light carefully measured. Sometimes, the deceased was laid down as though peacefully sleeping. Other times they were posed upright, eyes painted open, limbs adjusted, so they appeared alive. Children were placed beside them. Husbands beside wives. A family portrait, with death at its center. And so it was in this town. The family insisted the photograph be taken. Their reasoning was simple. This would be the last chance to remember. But neighbors whispered uneasily. Something about the arrangement felt wrong. Too urgent. Too insistent. As if the photograph was not just memory, but a shield. Look closely at the process. The photographer, sweating under the weight of his equipment, gave careful instructions. Stand here. Hold still. Look toward the lens. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the responsibility of his work. For once the shutter clicked, once the chemicals fixed the image, it would remain forever. Death preserved in silver and shadow. But what else would be preserved? In many surviving examples of post-mortem photography, unsettling history hides in plain sight. A mother holding a vanished child. A father's stiff hand resting unnaturally on his daughter's shoulder. Eyes painted too wide, too lifeless. To modern eyes, these images are disturbing. They speak of grief, yes, but also of obsession. A refusal to let go. A need to immortalize what should have been buried. This photograph carried more than grief. It carried suspicion. The mourners arranged themselves around the coffin. Their faces somber. Their clothes dark. Children pressed close, forced into stillness for the long exposure. Some wept quietly. Others stared blankly, unable to comprehend what they were part of. And there, in the shadows, stood one who should not have been there. A figure whose expression betrayed no sorrow, only composure. A mask of mourning, but behind it, something else. At first glance, the photograph seemed like any other from the era. Another disturbing image of death and memory, filed away with countless others, lost in time. But photographs tell stories their subjects never intended. And here, the story was far darker. Why had the family been so eager to pose with the dead? Why had the photographer been called with such haste? And why did certain details, hands, eyes, expressions, seem wrong when studied too closely? Neighbors whispered again. Some recalled hearing strange words from the house at night, spoken in a forbidden language. Others remembered arguments, curses, and threats. A child had once vanished for days, returned without explanation. The family was different. The kind people feared, but never confronted. And now, the ritual of post-mortem photography had captured them all together, frozen in a single moment. A ritual meant to preserve love had instead preserved deception. The coffin lay open. The deceased dressed immaculately, as though asleep. Yet whispers spread that the death had not been natural, that illness had not claimed this life, that something far more sinister had occurred behind those shuttered windows. But the photograph revealed none of this openly. It merely hinted. A smile too faint, a hand placed too firmly, a figure standing too still. That is the terror of such images. They do not speak. They do not confess. They only stare back, daring you to see what lies beneath. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. The family believed they were preserving memory. In truth, they were preserving evidence. Evidence of a crime that no coffin could conceal. As the photograph dried, as the chemicals fixed its ghostly shapes onto the plate, the town moved on. The funeral ended. The coffin was buried. The earth closed around the body. But the picture remained. A relic. A clue. A mirror of grief, hiding guilt in plain sight. Years later, when others studied the image, they would see it for what it was. Not just a tradition. Not just a ritual of memory. But a frozen crime scene. A chilling artifact of dark history, where horror storytelling begins not in shadow, but in light. For light captured it. Light revealed it. Light preserved it. And as the years passed, the photograph grew more disturbing, not less. Because once whispers begin, once secrets stir, a picture becomes more than memory. It becomes evidence. And evidence demands truth. The ritual was complete. The photograph finished. But what it truly revealed, that would only come to light later. The coffin in the photograph did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to someone the town knew well. A man whose life was ordinary on the surface, but surrounded by quiet unease. His name was spoken with a mix of respect and hesitation, for he was both part of the community and apart from it. He was not rich, but he was not poor. Not cruel, but not beloved. He lived between categories. A man tolerated more than trusted. The official story was simple. He had fallen ill. A sudden fever, doctors said. The kind that swept through towns in those years, taking lives quickly, leaving only silence behind. But whispers began almost immediately. Whispers that illness alone had not claimed him. The victim, let us call him Thomas, had been in good health days before. He had walked the fields, worked the soil, laughed at the tavern. Then, without warning, he was bedridden, sweating, trembling, eyes wide with fear more than pain. Those who saw him in his final hours said he muttered strange words, as if trying to confess, as if trying to name someone. But the words were garbled, half lost, like a forbidden language never meant to be understood. And then he was gone. The death was accepted by the family, though not without tension. His wife wept too fiercely, neighbors said, as if performing grief rather than feeling it. His children were restless, staring at the coffin with expressions too hollow for their age. One brother stood stiff and cold, offering no words, no tears. It was this strangeness that drew attention when the photograph was arranged. Post-mortem photography was not unusual, but the urgency with which this family demanded it, that was different. As if they wanted the moment preserved too carefully, as if they wanted proof of something, proof that he was gone. Thomas's life had not been spotless. He carried debts. He carried grudges. There were stories of heated arguments with neighbors, disputes over land, whispers of betrayal. Some claimed he had knowledge he was never meant to have, knowledge of the town's chilling secrets, whispered deals, sins best left forgotten. In a place already filled with suspicion, such knowledge was dangerous. And yet, for all his flaws, he was not hated enough to deserve death. Or so it seemed. But then came the eerie details. The night before his death, a neighbor swore they heard shouting from his home. Not the sound of illness, but of rage. Furniture overturned. A door slammed so violently the sound carried into the street. And then, silence. The next morning, Thomas was bedridden, pale as though something more than fever had claimed him. The doctor's explanation was brief. Too brief. A sudden sickness, he said. Nothing more. But those who saw the body before it was dressed for burial noticed faint bruising on his throat, a discoloration that did not match fever. A mark that whispered of struggle. The family dismissed it. The coffin was closed quickly. But photographs do not forget. When the camera shutter opened, when light carved his features into silver, the truth remained. Look closely at the image, and one sees not peaceful rest, but tension in the jaw, stiffness in the hands, eyes closed too tightly, signs that life had not left gently. The victim's story was not one of simple death. It was a story of silence, of someone cut off before he could speak, someone whose final words might have revealed too much. And so the town began to wonder. Had Thomas been silenced? Had someone close to him, perhaps even in that photograph, ensured his secrets would never leave the walls of his home? The family's behavior only deepened suspicion. The widow wore black, but her grief seemed rehearsed. The children stared at the coffin as though frightened of it. And one figure, captured forever in the corner of the photograph, stood too still, too calm, watching, waiting, as though guarding a truth that could not be allowed to surface. In dark history, the stories of the dead often speak louder than the living. And here, the story was clear. The victim had left behind not just a family, but a mystery. A mystery that clung to the photograph like a shadow. The town did not speak openly. But behind closed doors, questions grew louder. Who had argued with Thomas that night? Who had left the marks on his throat? And why did the photograph seem less like a farewell and more like evidence? The victim's story should have ended with his burial. Instead, it began again the moment the camera shutter closed. His face, stiff in death, became a silent accuser. His coffin, surrounded by mourners, became a stage where the murderer stood in plain sight. This was not just death. This was murder, carefully hidden, artfully disguised, but preserved forever in one chilling image. And though the town could not yet name the killer, the photograph had already done so. The wake began at dusk, when the last light of day turned the streets a bruised shade of purple. The house was crowded, its windows glowing faintly, shadows shifting behind curtains as mourners filed in. Inside, the air was heavy with incense, candles burning low, their smoke clinging to every surface like the memory of fire. The coffin sat in the center of the parlor, surrounded by flowers that were already beginning to wilt. Their sweetness did little to hide the sharper odor that lingered beneath. Visitors lowered their heads, muttered prayers, but few dared to linger by the body. Most kept their eyes fixed on the walls, on the old photographs hung crookedly, their glass reflecting the candlelight in fractured glimmers. It was there, in the stillness between prayers, that the whispers began. At first they were harmless. Remarks on Thomas's illness. Complaints about how sudden it all seemed. A mother telling her child not to stare at the coffin too long, for the dead could sometimes stare back. But then the tone shifted. Lower voices. Nervous glances. Words carried not by grief, but by fear. One old woman leaned in close to another. "Did you see his neck?" she murmured. "That was no sickness." Another claimed to have heard shouting days before the death, a quarrel that rattled the very walls of the house. And someone else, voice trembling, swore they saw the widow's hand stained with something dark the night before Thomas was bedridden. The room seemed to listen. Every whisper swelled, folding into the next, until the entire wake became a hive of suspicion. Yet no one spoke too loudly. The family hovered nearby, stiff and watchful. The widow drifted from mourner to mourner, her face streaked with tears, though her eyes never seemed wet. Her children stood apart, small figures in clothes too formal, their gazes fixed on the floorboards as though afraid to look at their father's face. And in the far corner, half hidden by the shadow of a drape, stood the brother, silent, expression unreadable. His stillness was unsettling, as if he were carved from the same wood as the coffin itself. The whispers grew sharper. Bruises, I tell you. No doctor worth his name would call it illness. Mark me, someone in this room knows the truth. The words slithered through the air, weaving around the mourners until the room itself felt hostile, suffocating. The photograph was taken during this very moment. The mourners frozen in their grief, the widow clutching her veil, the children pale and small, the brother in the corner, his eyes like dark stones, the coffin at the center, its occupant silent yet accusing. Look closely at the photograph, and you can almost hear the whispers. You can almost see the fear etched into their postures. It was not the grief of losing a loved one. It was the dread of being watched by the dead. The ritual of mourning should have brought peace, but instead it brought unease. Plates of untouched food sat on the table. The clock ticked too loudly, each chime echoing like a warning, and all the while, the eyes of the mourners darted toward the coffin, toward the widow, toward the silent brother, searching for signs, searching for guilt. One child, too young to know better, whispered aloud what the adults only feared to say. Papa didn't die. Papa was taken. The room froze. The words hung there, sharp and cruel, piercing through the thick air of incense and whispers. The widow hissed and pulled the child close, silencing him with a grip too firm for comfort. But the damage was done. Every gaze shifted. Every suspicion deepened. The wake became a stage, and every actor was aware of the roles they played. The grieving widow, the silent children, the cold brother, the watchful neighbors, clutching rosaries and muttering prayers as though they could ward off the truth. And the truth sat in the coffin, his story untold, his silence louder than any sermon. The photograph was meant to capture memory, to honor the dead. Instead, it preserved suspicion. Look again at the image. One mourner glances sideways, lips pressed thin, as though holding back words. Another leans slightly away from the coffin, as if afraid to be too close. And there, in the shadows, one figure's faint smirk betrays not sorrow, but satisfaction. Was the murderer bold enough to stand among them, smiling faintly as the camera preserved the moment? Was the wake not a farewell, but a mockery, one final performance of grief for a crime still warm in the air? The whispers swelled until they seemed to shake the very floorboards. And yet, no one dared to say the word aloud. Murder. But the photograph had already said it for them. And somewhere in that crowded room, one person was listening closely to every whisper, not with fear, but with amusement. The day after the wake, the photographer returned to his studio with a heavy plate that contained the family's grief. He carried it carefully, as though the glass itself bore not only the image, but the weight of something far more dangerous. At the time, photography was still an expensive luxury, reserved for weddings, births, and deaths. And for funerals, it was a ritual. Post-mortem photography meant to immortalize the face of the departed, proof that they had once lived and now belonged to memory. He closed the shutters, lit his lamps, and began the process. The chemicals hissed as they spread across the plate. The room filled with the sharp, metallic tang of developer. Slowly, shapes began to emerge, first the outline of the coffin, then the gathered mourners, their forms frozen in grief. As the image deepened, the shadows seemed to move. Look closely. At first glance, the photograph was ordinary. The coffin, the widow, the children, the brother, standing off to the side, faces pale, eyes weary, frozen in a moment of ritual mourning. But as the photographer leaned closer, something unsettled him. The expressions were wrong. The widow's veil obscured her face, but beneath the lace there was no softness, no grief. Instead, her mouth was pressed into something that almost resembled a smile. The children, rather than appearing merely somber, looked hollow. Their eyes, dark and glassy, seemed too wide, as though forced to witness something they did not understand. And the brother, still in the shadows, his face was clearer now. His lips curled in a way that was neither sorrowful nor respectful. It was faint, but unmistakable, the shadow of satisfaction. The photographer blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced it was only the distortion of the chemicals. Yet the more the image solidified, the worse it became. There was another detail, small but undeniable. Thomas's neck, the one the mourners whispered about. In the photograph, the bruise was visible. A dark mark, faint but captured forever. The camera had recorded what the human eye only dared to whisper, a wound that should not have been there. The photographer's hands trembled as he hung the plate to dry. He knew what he saw, but he also knew the danger of speaking it aloud. In a town so small, secrets were weapons. To accuse someone of murder without proof was to bring ruin upon yourself. And yet, the photograph was proof. Proof trapped in silver nitrate and glass. That night, when the photograph was shown to the family, the room grew silent. The widow accepted it without a word, her gloved fingers tightening around the frame. The children refused to look, and the brother only stared at the image with a stillness that was far too calm, as though he had expected this all along. The neighbors, however, whispered. They pointed at the bruise on the neck, the strange expressions, the unnatural way the family seemed posed. Some claimed that the widow's smile was proof of guilt. Others swore the brother's smirk betrayed his role in the crime. A few even whispered that the children knew more than they were telling, their hollow gazes revealing the heavy silence they were forced to carry. The photograph became more than memory. It became evidence. It became accusation. Soon, strange things began to happen. The photograph was said to change when left in the dark. Mourners claimed that, if you looked too long, you could see one of the figures shifting in the shadows, that the eyes of the widow seemed to follow you, that Thomas's face, though still, appeared more lifelike than it should have, his expression twisting, his lips parting as though he were trying to speak. Post-mortem photographs were meant to honor the dead. This one whispered a different story. It did not comfort. It accused. And in a town where secrets were buried deeper than graves, the image was dangerous. It was a mirror the family did not want to look into. It was a reminder that one among them might not be a mourner at all, but the murderer hiding in plain sight. The whispers at the wake had been suspicion. Now the photograph was proof, or so it seemed. But proof is a dangerous thing, especially when it points to more than one suspect, especially when the image itself begins to reveal details that no living soul should have seen. For in the lower corner of the photograph, where no one remembered standing, the faint shape of another figure began to emerge. A face that should not have been there at all. The photograph spread through the town like smoke through dry rafters. First one neighbor saw it, then another. Within days, it was the subject of every whispered conversation, every nervous glance exchanged at the marketplace, every candlelit gathering in the evenings. People spoke of the bruise on Thomas's neck as though it were gospel now. They traced the line of darkness in the photograph with trembling fingers, muttering that sickness could not leave such a mark. Others pointed to the widow's faint smile, claiming it betrayed not grief but triumph. And the brother's shadowy smirk, once overlooked, was now undeniable. The photograph had become more than memory. It had become a weapon. At night, the whispers carried further. Some claimed they had heard quarrels echoing from the family home in the weeks before Thomas's death. Others swore the widow had purchased strange powders from the apothecary, medicines no respectable woman would ever request. The apothecary himself denied it, but his silence was too long, too deliberate. Soon, suspicion spread to the children. Their hollow stares, captured forever in the image, unsettled many. Children cannot lie with their eyes, one woman said. They saw what happened. They know. It was as though the photograph had unlocked something long buried. Old grudges resurfaced. Neighbors who once shared meals now crossed the street to avoid one another. Every detail of Thomas's death was dissected and twisted into something darker. Even the coffin itself became suspect, some whispering that it had been closed too quickly, as though to hide what was truly done to the body. But it was the figure in the corner that haunted them most. That faint, blurred outline that no one could account for. Too tall to be a child. Too gaunt to be any known mourner. A face without name, captured by accident or by design. Some swore it was only a trick of the chemicals, a blemish in the glass. Others whispered of spirits, of the dead rising to watch their own farewell. The more the townspeople stared at the photograph, the more it stared back. Eyes seemed to follow. Shadows seemed to shift. Some swore that, late at night, when left alone with the image, they could hear a faint sound, like breathing. The family, once respected, now lived under a cloud of fear. The widow rarely left the house, her veil now a constant mask. The brother remained silent, slipping through the streets like a ghost. And the children, watched too closely, pitied too heavily, became symbols of innocence corrupted by a household of secrets. By summer's end, the town was divided. Half believed the widow had poisoned her husband. Half believed the brother had struck him in rage. A few whispered darker things still, that the children themselves were not as innocent as they appeared, that they had inherited something from their bloodline. A curse whispered of in forbidden language. And all the while, the photograph remained. One evening, a group of townsfolk gathered in the tavern. The image laid out on the table like evidence at a trial. Candlelight danced across the glass, illuminating the bruise, the smirk, the hollow eyes. Voices rose. Fingers pointed. Names were spoken aloud for the first time. The widow killed him. No, the brother. Look at his smile. You're both wrong. There is someone else in this picture. Someone not of this earth. The argument grew heated, the air thick with tension. And then, a sudden hush fell. For one man, staring harder than the rest, swore he saw something move in the photograph. Not in the shadows. Not in the faces. But in the coffin itself. He swore Thomas's eyes had opened. The tavern erupted in fear. The photograph was snatched away, hidden beneath a cloth. No one wished to look again. But the damage was done. The suspicion was no longer only about who had killed Thomas. It was now about whether Thomas was truly gone at all. The town had lived with its share of grief before. Accidents, fevers, disappearances. But this was different. This was not grief. This was infection, an unsettling history spreading through every street, every household, poisoning trust and planting dread. Neighbors watched one another as if every face might conceal a killer. Families locked their doors earlier. Prayers grew longer, but less certain. And in the silence of their homes, many could not resist pulling out the photograph again, staring at its eerie details, searching for new truths, convinced that if they just looked closely enough, the hidden murderer would reveal themselves. But the more they stared, the more they saw. And the more they saw, the more the photograph revealed something that no one wanted to admit. Because one by one, faces in the town began to swear they saw their own reflections in that shadowy corner. The photograph would not let them rest. It lingered in every home, every whisper, every darkened thought. Yet one detail drew the eye again and again, the faint, unsettling smile on the brother's lips. At first, some dismissed it as nothing, a trick of the chemicals, the way the shadows caught his face. But the more people looked, the less they could deny it. The smile was deliberate. It was not sorrow. It was not grief. It was satisfaction. Why would a man smile at his brother's funeral? The question clung to the town like a damp fog. Every errand the brother ran was watched. Every silence was dissected. Neighbors who once greeted him now crossed to the other side of the street. Children whispered and pointed, calling him the Smiler, too frightened to say his real name. Soon, old stories resurfaced. Rumors of the brothers' quarrels over land, money, and inheritance. Some claimed Thomas had threatened to cut his brother out of the will. Others recalled shouting late at night, words too muffled to understand, but tones sharp enough to curdle the air. And then there were the darker whispers, the ones spoken only after midnight, that the brother had been seen lingering near the apothecary, speaking in hushed tones, that he had once been caught with books in a forbidden language, pages full of symbols no one should understand. Some even swore he had wandered the cemetery at night, speaking aloud to stones as if the dead could answer. The photograph became the final piece in this puzzle. His smile, captured forever, was no longer just an odd expression. It was proof, they said. Proof that he had wanted Thomas gone. Proof that he was proud of what he had done. But the truth was more tangled than anyone guessed. When questioned, the brother never denied the smile. He never offered excuse nor defense. Instead, he told a single chilling story. That as the photographer prepared the shot, he felt something brush against him. Something cold, something unseen. A presence that leaned close, so close he swore he could feel breath against his ear. And in that instant, he smiled, not from joy, not from triumph, but from fear. A nervous, instinctive smile that cracked across his face because if he hadn't smiled, he might have screamed. Few believed him. To most, it sounded like the words of a guilty man caught in his own snare. But for others, it struck too close to something they themselves had felt. For hadn't several mourners confessed to strange sensations at the wake? A shifting shadow in the corner of the parlor? A sudden chill near the coffin? A whisper no one could place? The photograph froze it all. The bruise, the hollow children, the widow's strange stillness, the brother's smile. Yet what if that smile did not belong to the living at all? Late one night, a man who studied the photograph by lamplight claimed he saw another mouth, faint and pale, overlapping the brother's own, as though someone else's smile had been superimposed upon his face. A ghostly grin, mocking and wide, belonging not to flesh but to something lost in time. The theory spread quickly. Some now swore that the brother's smile was not his at all, that it belonged to Thomas himself, that in death, Thomas had returned to claim his final portrait, bending the features of the living into his own dreadful expression. Others, darker still, believed the opposite, that the brother had let something in, that his studies in forbidden books and his midnight walks had opened a door no man should touch, that the smile was not human at all, but something else wearing his face. The truth was blurred, as it always is in towns where history is written in whispers. Was the brother's smirk a sign of murder, of madness, or of possession? No one agreed. But no one slept easily either, because once you saw the smile, you could not unsee it. And once it fixed itself in your memory, it had a way of returning, haunting your dreams, curling at the edges of your vision in every darkened room. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying expression is not a scream, but a grin. And then, one night, the photograph disappeared. Taken from its frame, vanished from the house where it had been kept under lock and key. When it surfaced again, it carried a new and dreadful change. The brother's smile was wider. By autumn, the photograph was no longer just a relic of grief. It was an indictment. It had passed through so many hands that its glass edges were chipped, its frame worn. Yet the bruise on Thomas's neck remained clear. The hollow children stared on, and the brother's sinister smile grew more infamous with each retelling. The town could not ignore it any longer. Whispers turned to demands. There must be an inquiry, they said. The sheriff must question the widow. The brother must stand before the law. And yet, no inquiry came. The sheriff, a weary man with too many debts and too few allies, hesitated. He knew the family. He knew their reach. To accuse one of murder was to invite retaliation. Worse still, he had seen the photograph himself, and what he saw unsettled him so deeply that he dared not touch it again. Because in the dim light of his office, he swore the coffin's lid was slightly ajar. So the town simmered. Justice was demanded in daylight. But by nightfall, silence prevailed. Fear hung over every household. If the murderer was indeed the widow or the brother, or both, then to accuse them publicly was to risk vanishing before dawn. And already, one or two who had spoken too boldly were no longer seen at market. Their absence was explained away as illness or travel, but the truth was clear enough. Silence was safer than justice. Still, the photograph would not let the town rest. It had become an unholy relic, dragged into taverns, held up in arguments, whispered over in church pews. Some claimed it was cursed, that those who stared too long at the image began to see their own reflections hidden in its shadows. Others insisted it was evidence of a crime too monstrous to ignore. The widow remained cloistered, her veil a constant curtain between her and the world. Yet her hands trembled when she was seen, as though the weight of unspoken truths pressed harder with every passing day. The brother, by contrast, seemed to thrive in suspicion. His silence became its own weapon. He neither defended nor confessed. His presence alone was enough to unnerve anyone who met his eyes. And always, there was the smile. The cursed smile. The detail no one could escape. A meeting was finally called in the town hall. Men and women crowded the wooden benches, the air thick with sweat, smoke, and tension. The photograph was laid out once more, as though it were a witness to be cross-examined. Voices clashed, some shouting for justice, others for silence. One man rose, his voice trembling with conviction. "We cannot allow this to pass. A murderer hides among us, and we are complicit if we turn away." Another answered with equal force. "And if you are wrong? If the photograph lies? Then we condemn the innocent. Better silence than blood on all our hands." The room fractured. Justice or silence? Which was the greater sin? Outside, the church bell tolled. Its iron voice echoed through the night, as though summoning judgment itself. Inside, no verdict was reached. The meeting ended in anger, fear, and unanswered prayers. The photograph was tucked away once more, but its power had only grown, because the next morning, it was no longer the same. A new detail had appeared, just as the bruise had revealed itself, just as the smile had twisted wider. Now, another mourner's face bore a change. The widow's lips, once faintly pressed together, now parted into something unmistakable. A smile that matched the brother's. It was as though the photograph had chosen its own verdict. Justice or silence? The town no longer had a choice. The image itself was speaking, reshaping, condemning. And if the dead could accuse, what chance did the living have? As the townspeople gathered around the altered photograph, too afraid to speak, one of the children finally broke the silence. Their voice was small, trembling, but clear enough to freeze every heart in the room. "You're all looking at the wrong face." The room went still. Every breath held, every candle flickered sharp in the silence. "You're all looking at the wrong face," the child repeated, their small voice steady, though their eyes shimmered with something far older than innocence. Every gaze turned to the photograph. Not to the widow. Not to the brother. Not to Thomas in his coffin. But to the blurred figure in the corner, the face that should not have been there. For the first time, the crowd admitted what they had tried to ignore. The outline was too clear, too distinct, too deliberate. A tall shadow, thin and unnatural, with eyes like hollow wells. A figure no one had seen at the wake, yet captured forever in silver nitrate. Whispers swelled into panic. Some said it was a stranger. Others claimed it was the spirit of Thomas himself, risen to accuse. A few, their voices trembling, whispered the name of something older, a presence spoken of only in forbidden language, a watcher that appeared at moments of death, a figure that thrived on grief and secrets. The child pointed at the photograph, their finger quivering. "That's the one who smiled." The crowd recoiled. Some cried out in fear. Others rushed to silence the child, to dismiss the words as fantasy. But the photograph would not let them lie. Look closely, and the blurred figure seemed to shift. Its mouth, faint and pale, curved into the same unnatural smile that had haunted the brother. The truth unraveled in an instant. The brother's smirk, the widow's strange expression, the bruise on Thomas's neck, all of it was part of something larger, something darker. Not merely murder, not merely suspicion, but intrusion. A hidden truth etched into the photograph by something no one dared name. And yet, The town could not agree. Some clung to the idea of murder, insisting that one of the living was guilty and must face justice. Others whispered that the dead, or something beyond the dead, had taken part in the ritual of memory, that the photograph itself was cursed, a doorway rather than a record. But no verdict came. No justice was served. Silence returned, heavier than before. The family withdrew from public life. The widow remained veiled until the day she vanished from her home, leaving no trace behind. The brother was last seen walking into the woods at dusk, carrying no lantern, never to return. The children were taken in by distant relatives, who swore the little ones never smiled again. And the photograph? It vanished too, passed from hand to hand until its trail dissolved into rumor. Some say it was buried deep in the churchyard, sealed under stone to keep the figure contained. Others claim it still surfaces from time to time, appearing in antique shops, hidden among boxes of forgotten photographs, its glass cracked, its shadows darker than ever. But wherever it lies, the legend endures. The funeral photograph of 1902, the image that revealed too much. The smile that should never have been. Perhaps it was murder. Perhaps it was something older, darker, a sinister past bleeding into the present. Or perhaps the photograph was never meant for mortal eyes at all. A fragment of unsettling history, captured by accident, reminding us that some truths are not to be recorded. One thing is certain, the town never spoke of it openly again. Justice was buried. Silence prevailed. And yet, in that silence, the photograph story grew louder than words. Because in the end, it was not the bruise, nor the widow, nor the brother's expression that terrified them most. It was the thought that the photograph had captured not a moment, but a presence, that whoever stood smiling in that corner had not left, and perhaps never will. Haunting outro narration style. So the next time you stumble upon an old photograph, especially one of the dead, look closely. Look at the faces. Look at the shadows. At first glance, everything may seem ordinary, but hidden in the grain, behind the glass, you may find a detail that should not be there. A bruise, a smirk, a smile that doesn't belong. And if you stare too long, you may feel it too, the sensation that someone is standing just behind you, leaning closer, waiting for you to notice them. The story of the funeral photograph with a hidden murderer was never solved. Justice was never served. But silence. Silence can be more dangerous than guilt. And perhaps, somewhere tonight, that photograph still waits in the dark, smiling.